So we have up here a picture of our Minister of Foreign Affairs, the gentleman here on the right, the Honorable Lawrence Cannon, and he is shaking hands with the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon. And this was taken at the ratification event in New York on March 11th. I have been really fortunate throughout the development of the convention to be really involved with its development. I attended most of the negotiating sessions. I was fortunate enough to be there when we signed the convention and when we ratified as well. So it's something I feel pretty deeply committed to. So what is it? As I mentioned, it's an international law. But what's inside of it is 50 articles. And if you look through this document, it doesn't highlight all 50 of them, but it talks a little bit about what a convention is, what it does, and some of the articles that are contained within it. Overall, there's 50 articles in this convention, and what it does is say what existing human rights mean for people with disabilities. It's a cross-disability convention, so it isn't just about people with intellectual disabilities, it's about everyone in the world who has a disability. And it says nothing new from a rights perspective. It articulates those rights and what they mean for people with disabilities. It has what we call an optional protocol, and that is basically a complaints mechanism. So if you have a challenge with your country, you can take that challenge to the international level and say, my country has ratified this convention and is not following my rights. We'll get into some of the more technical issues as we go, but Canada has not signed or ratified the optional protocol. We have ratified the convention, but not the complaints mechanism. As I mentioned, it establishes no new rights, and its purpose is to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, and to promote respect for their inherent dignity. Not a bad purpose. Pretty good thing to be starting with. So one of the questions we get a lot, why do we need a UN convention? You know, in Canada, we've got human rights acts, we've got the Charter. Internationally, there's a number of international human rights laws. So why a disability-specific convention? And one of the reasons is the global context for disability. When we look around the world, there's about 650 million people with a disability, and about 400 million of them live in a developing country, so in the global south. And this is a thing that's been pulled together by a group called 400 Million R, and it's sort of a neat way of looking at what the disability context is in a global perspective. And they say that if everyone with a disability lived together in the same place, they would make up the third largest country in the world. It would be a country about the size of the European Union. It would be the least educated country with the highest rates of infant mortality, few employment opportunities, and restricted access to democratic processes. And without a doubt, it would be the poorest country in the world. And that's a pretty stunning picture when you look at that internationally of what's going on with disability. When we break it down into some more concrete numbers, we know that of about the 650 million people with disabilities, about 130 million people in the world have an intellectual disability. So around the world, in Canada, we've got about 750,000 people with an intellectual disability, but throughout the country, it's about 130 million. And if we look at the bigger number, 650 million, and you include family members in that, it means that about 2 billion people in the world are directly affected by disability. That represents almost a third of the world's population. This is not a small group of people or a small marginalized population. That's a big chunk of who we are, who our communities are, who our world is. So as I mentioned earlier, about 80% live in developing countries. And around the world, about 80% of people with disabilities are unemployed. Less than 2% of kids with disabilities in developing countries are going to school. And while people with disabilities generally are thought to make up about 10% of the global population, they make up 20% of those living in poverty. So that means 1 in 5 of the poorest of the poor are people with disabilities. And when you break that down into intellectual disability, it means that about 26 million people with an intellectual disability are living on less than $1 a day. So when you look at those numbers, it becomes clear pretty quickly that this is a staggering crisis around the world where people with disabilities are not having their rights realized. And it took countries a while to really be able to look at that and realize that we needed to do something about it. That our existing human rights mechanisms were not addressing that global picture of disability. While we've seen some progress, it wasn't ramping up on a wide scale. A couple of other factors were at play. We understand disability very differently now than we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 60 years ago. So it was over 60 years ago that the United Nations first drafted the UN Declaration on Human Rights. And it was kind of the first real significant international human rights document. And our understanding of the world has changed so much since then. So really this evolving understanding of disability, our evolving understanding of human rights, led us to realize we needed to have a convention that specifically addressed the rights of people with disabilities. We learned in the last 60 years of rights evolution that groups of people experience disability or experience discrimination and violations to their rights in particular ways. So we saw, again, over the last number of decades, a convention on the rights of women, a convention on the rights of kids, a convention against torture, a convention on racial discrimination. And what that was showing us is that you had to address the particular needs of a group of people to understand why their rights aren't being realized. And again, as our understanding of disability has changed from kind of an outdated charitable model into recognizing that disability really is more about our interactions with communities, it's about those barriers as opposed to anything inherent into any one of us. And as I mentioned, those existing human rights documents that we had just weren't making a real difference. And not for lack of trying. If you look through the UN's history, they've actually done a lot on disability. Pretty outdated stuff now, we would say, but at the time, they really were looking at disability from what they would think would be the most progressive stuff at the time. So throughout the 1950s and the 1970s, we saw a couple of resolutions around disability, again, more based in like a health model, rehabilitation. We had 2 declarations, which now have extremely outdated language, but it demonstrated their recognition that there was an issue going on. And then things started to change a little bit in 1982. We had the World Program of Action on people with disabilities that was adopted, and that included a new objective in the world, and it was the equalization of opportunities. And at the time, that was a really radical concept of how we move forward the inclusion of people with disabilities internationally. From the World Program of Action, we had a decade, so the United Nations committed 10 years to focusing on disability. We had a lot of really great reports, a lot of statistics, but again, we didn't get a real understanding of what we need to do to be making a difference. In about 1987, so during that decade, the first proposal for a UN convention was floated through the governments, and they couldn't get agreement to it. People didn't think that it was necessary. People said, oh, we have all these existing human rights instruments, we don't need another one. And they closed off the decade by adopting what's known as the Standard Rules on the Equalization of Opportunities for People with Disabilities. It was a non-binding agreement, so it meant that you weren't required to follow it. It wasn't like an international law. But at the time, it was certainly the most comprehensive approach and the most progressive approach to disability that we'd had. But again, by 2000, it was starting to fall short a little bit. So they reintroduced the idea of having a UN convention. And in 2001, in December of 2001, Mexico put forward a resolution to the United Nations General Assembly, so their main body, and suggested that the United Nations explore the development of a UN convention specifically on the rights of people with disabilities. And the UN agreed. They said this is a good idea. And they established what we call an ad hoc committee. And ad hoc means sort of one-off. So it was a one-time committee designed to look at this one particular issue. And throughout 2002 to 2006, that ad hoc committee met 8 times. There was a working group that met early days to kind of pull together a bit of a draft text that people could begin to look at. And from the outset, it was an interesting group of people who were part of that ad hoc committee. Who do you think would be part of the committee? If you were at the United Nations and you had an ad hoc committee group. Do you think countries would be on that? Yeah. Do you think those delegations are usually lawyers, diplomats, ambassadors, people from foreign affairs? Does that kind of make sense? Who would be on that? There's also a body called National Institutes for Human Rights. National Human Rights Institutes. Had that switched around. And those would be groups like the Canadian Human Rights Commission and other international or other countries that have human rights commissions. Does it kind of make sense that they would be part of international negotiations on human rights? Yeah, I think so too. But for the first time ever, there was another group that was part of that ad hoc committee. And that was us. It was civil society. It was people like you and me who work for disability organizations. It's people with disabilities themselves. It was family members who were there in New York as part of those negotiations and making sure that our lived experience, our voices, our knowledge were part of the words that became international law. That's a really big change for the United Nations, to actually have individuals who are directly affected by a convention that engaged in making it real. So that happened between 2002 and 2006. In December of 2006, the United Nations General Assembly, so again, their big body, formally adopted the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It was open for signature on March 30th of 2007, and I'll talk a little bit about what some of those terms mean in a while. On May 3rd of 2008, it became international law. You have to have a certain number of countries ratify it and say that they legally agree to it before you can say it's international law. So May 3rd of 2008, and on March 10th of 2011, a little bit later than we would like, Canada finally became one of those countries who ratified the convention. Now, it's a convention of many firsts. It's a unique convention for a number of reasons, and it accomplished many things that no other convention has. It is the first human rights treaty of the 21st century. It is the fastest negotiated human rights convention in UN history. So from 2001, when the proposal went through, to 2006, when they formally adopted it, to 2007, when they opened it up for signature, is the equivalent of lightning speed at the United Nations. Nothing moves that fast at the UN. So this was a really clear momentum building experience. People were excited about it, and it's moved forward really, really quickly. As I said, it's the first time in history civil society actively participated. It's the first human rights convention with an explicit social development dimension that looks explicitly at the issues around what it means to have rights realized. It isn't just a listing of rights that you can hold up and say, I have a right to this. It actually walks through what is required to make those rights real, which is a pretty big shift for human rights law. And when the convention was opened for signature in March of 2007, 82 countries signed on that first day. And that's the biggest number of countries to sign on to a convention on opening day in UN history. So again, demonstrating the, I think, excitement about this, the commitment to this on a global scale. And interestingly, for our Canadian audience, it's the first time that Canada has ever signed a convention on opening day. We've signed and ratified most conventions, that is part of our history, but it hadn't happened before on opening day, and we made that happen. You guys made that happen. Our movement made that happen. Canada had told us they were not going to sign on opening day, It was too hard. They had too much work to do. They still had to talk to the provinces. And we as a movement joined with the broader disability community and said, no, that is not okay. We need to be at the table. We need to be there on opening day. And at the time, our Minister of Foreign Affairs was Peter MacKay, who lives in Nova Scotia. And his riding in Nova Scotia was inundated, absolutely inundated. They got letters, faxes, emails, people coming into his office in near Pictou, people calling his Hill office, saying, you know, Peter, step up. We need to make this happen. And they did, which is a great lesson about the power of our own voices. So I've talked a bit about why we need a UN convention, some of the unique things this convention accomplished, and that's quite a bit of prestige for one little convention to carry. And the reason I think it accomplished a number of those things is because it's a different convention. It's unlike any human rights document we've ever seen before. And I'll walk through a bit why I think it's different. So one, participatory. I talked about how this is the first time civil society's been actively involved, and boy were we involved. So this is a picture of the main room in the United Nations where we did all the negotiating. In the middle area here along these main tables are the government delegations. Government delegations were interesting to watch as they evolved over the process. So at the beginning, they tended to be lawyers, diplomats, people from their foreign affairs department, people involved in international human rights law. A couple of them had some direct representation of people with disabilities on them. By the end of it, all of them had representation from people with disabilities on their delegations. We also had, sort of sitting around the other parts of the room, those members of civil society, you and me, our organizations, our international organizations, who were there negotiating with other countries. By our last negotiating session, we had more than 800 civil society members registered and accredited to participate in New York. It had a huge impact on this convention. It was because people could hear stories and meet people and learn and understand how law and how our practices have created exclusion, have created isolation, have institutionalized people, have discriminated against people. And being able to share those stories changes minds. We all know that. When you get your story out there, people really can better understand what happens. It put a name and a face to exclusion. It also meant the UN had to figure out accommodation and inclusion on the fly. So think of the United Nations building. It was built sort of early 1940s in New York. Hasn't had much work done to it since then, to be honest. We were negotiating in the basement of the United Nations building. We've got people in wheelchairs that have to get down there, and they still have those old elevators that are operated by an elevator operator, and you can fit like 2 people in there. They had to figure out that. They had to figure out the United Nations hands out more paper than you can imagine. Every time anyone says anything on the floor, it has to be documented. And everyone's got to get a piece of paper. There are forests who have been destroyed over this, I am sure. But they suddenly had to figure out, how do we get this out in alternative print? How do we get this out in Braille? How do we manage to ensure that people are being included? We had to ensure that people were using plain language. I invite you to ask a group of lawyers talking about technical issues related to legal capacity to use plain language. But they had to figure that out, and for the most part, they did. Even the UN cafeteria suddenly had to figure out what it meant to ensure that they were being inclusive and that they had room in the cafeteria. So it was that real transformative impact